Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, bringing you discussions concerning fair cattle markets. Today we have the opportunity to chat with Gary Cammack of Cammack Ranch Supply, located in Union Center, South Dakota. For starters, can you just tell me a little bit about your background, where you're located, and your involvement within the cattle industry?
I was born and raised at Stoneville, South Dakota, which is about 60 miles northeast of Sturgis. Grew up there on a cattle ranch, and I've had some differing degrees of ownership of cattle since I was 9 years old, I guess. Right out of high school, I worked in the construction industry for a while. Worked as an iron worker, and I worked in 5 states around here, and ended up working in Alaska on the Alaskan pipeline. Then we moved kind of in the middle of that. My wife and I moved back to Stoneville and bought a general store there, kind of a place where you sell whatever you can sell, and you got gas pumps out front, and sell some salt and some feed and some groceries and some produce, and you live in the back. We bought that in 1973, and then had an opportunity to buy a feed mill that was on Highway 34, and that was in 1979, and we've been here ever since. Been growing all the time. And so then what we did was my wife and I had bought our first piece of agricultural ground, I believe in 1978, and we've been growing our ranch and growing our cow herd ever since.
Okay, and you were part of the South Dakota legislature, correct?
Yeah, I serve as a senator in the South Dakota legislature, yes.
Gary, what do you feel are some of the issues standing in the way of fair cattle markets?
Anytime that you can get some additional competition in the market, that's always a good thing. And we've seen consolidation of the industry, the packing industry. We've seen consolidation of that packing industry really ever since I've been in business for the last 40 years. That consolidation has finally got to the point where there's very limited competition. The other thing is that the packers are able to contract cattle well in advance of when they need them, and a fairly high percentage of their needs is contracted. So when the markets start to move contrary to where they want to be, then they have the captive cattle supplies to fall back on. They don't have a sense of urgency to bid higher if you've already got some cattle bought at that level until they get those used up. And it acts as a fairly considerable shock absorber, which doesn't necessarily always work in our favor, because by the time their need to bid higher finally comes along after they've exhausted their contract cattle supply, then sometimes that demand has already diminished somewhat, so it has a tendency to hold those prices down.
So what do you feel are some solutions that could be implemented to fix these issues?
Up until the last couple of years, I had heard people talk about breaking up the packers into some smaller entities, and I wasn't sure that really was the answer. But after the fire in the Holcomb plant and after the COVID debacle, I can see that there would have been a real benefit in having 6 or 8 entities, major entities out there instead of 2. If there would have been 6 or 8 entities out there, then a incident like the fire or the incident like COVID wouldn't necessarily hit all of them at the same time, because their workforce would be scattered out, and even if it did hit them all, it wouldn't necessarily be all at the same time. And so because of that, I'm starting to rethink how I felt in the past.
There has been a lot of talk about, as you mentioned, increasing competition within our cattle markets, and Senator Grassley from Iowa and Senator Tester from Montana, they've proposed the 5014 legislation to require packers to purchase 50% of their cattle on the negotiated cash trade market. What are your thoughts on this legislation?
I think that it has some merit. It would lessen the amount of contract cattle that they have, and it would force them to go out on the open market to competitively bid to make sure that they have adequate supplies to keep their chain speed up and make a profit.
There is currently a petition circulating to bring about a beef checkoff referendum, to bring the beef checkoff to an up or down vote. What are your thoughts on this?
I've been in business long enough to understand the importance of perception of a product, and perception is truth. So the beef checkoff has been spent to promote beef, make an effort to keep at the front of the thinking of the American consumer. But it's also the perception of how they perceive their beef ends up on their plate. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that the checkoff has done a good job of convincing that consumer that the U.S. beef producer is still the guy that wears the white hat. And without someone out there constantly beating the drum, we could lose that perception, because you have one fringe group that comes out and says, the ranching industry is environmentally irresponsible. People can say anything they want anymore. And unless there's somebody out there that in an organized process and has a plan ahead of time to be able to answer those, in most cases, false allegations and just painting us falsely, unless you have someone out there that has put the thought into it to make sure that you can respond to it quickly, respond to it professionally, and has the connections within the media, both the print media, the broadcast media, the social media. Unless you have someone that's out there and organized and can respond to that within hours, you can lose so much ground so quick it isn't even funny. What they do is in my mind, is very important. And it goes back to our business, Cammack Ranch Supply, is 45 miles from any incorporated municipality. And we spend a lot of money on promotion every year. And without that continued effort, within not a very few years, we wouldn't be here. Just because, go back to the 100-year-old church has to ring its bell. I really believe that we need those folks out there that live and eat and breathe protecting and promoting the beef industry. And if we don't do it ourselves, nobody's going to do it for us. And it can't be just somebody responding to a Facebook post, responding that Facebook post is false. Well, that's not going to help you, because it's a lone voice in the wilderness. And if somebody says something outrageous enough, it will go viral, and a bunch of people are going to believe it. And so it's because of that, it's so important that we have that planned professional response.
We're seeing more now than ever that consumers want to know where their food comes from, basically where anything comes from that they purchase. However, we do not have any labeling on our beef here in America. What are your thoughts on MCOOL?
In the last year's legislature, I authored a resolution and passed through both houses, and it was sent on to Washington, D.C. to encourage the trade representatives to negotiate with both Mexico and Canada to get it to the point where they would allow us to put that in place. When we had it in place before, we lost in the WTO 2 or 3 times, and finally it came to the point where the industry was going to have $1 billion worth of tariffs brought against us. So the resolution that I brought last year encouraged our trade representatives, because we've just got the Mexico-Canada trade agreement in place, but there's still a significant amount of negotiation that has to be accomplished. And so within that framework, I think it's a golden opportunity to be able to negotiate to where we can get that country of origin labeling in place without facing those tariffs. If those two countries don't that, actually in person and whatever. And guess what happened right about that time? COVID come along, and so that interaction wasn't quite as possible. He still did get that delivered and make sure that he was aware that that resolution came down from South Dakota to encourage that. But the president he is all about tough negotiations, and I believe that this is, again, I think this is a moment in time where we could accomplish something because of all of the things that are in play right now.
So you touched on President Trump. Earlier this spring, he made a comment that he would like to terminate all trade deals where we import cattle into the United States. What are your thoughts on imports of cattle and beef?
I think that the imports of cattle and beef, and again, at first blush you say, well, no, we can produce enough of our own stuff to accomplish that. But you've got to take into consideration all of the different ramifications and all of the different unintended consequences, again, that something like that would cause. I'm not saying that it doesn't, in certain cases, doesn't have some merit, but for instance, in some cases, we have some problem coming up with enough trimming from our finished cattle to bring hamburger to the fat content that the American consumer desires. And then the other thing is we've always got to keep in mind that trade is a two-way street, and the lining of the stomach has very limited market potential in the U.S. It has huge market potential in Latin American countries. The offal, whether it be the hides or the colon or the contents of the rumen, the value of the offal is significant enough that it makes the difference between profit and loss in the cattle industry. And so we've got to consider that we don't have a market for the hides in the U.S. We don't have a market for the gut lining. We don't have a market for the intestines. And there's markets for those products in other countries. And so we don't want to get into a place where we get into a spitting match where we have the potential to lose some of those markets by restricting their ability to do some trade with us back and forth. Like I say, trade is a two-way street. You want to play the chess game all the way to the end.
The DOJ is currently investigating our 4 big beef processors. What are your thoughts on this investigation? Do you think it's going to yield any results that will be productive for the cattle industry?
I applaud the investigation, but I question whether or not there will be anything come forward that shows illegal activity. To me and to everyone else that's in the industry, when you've got the packers that are selling beef at record high prices, and you've got the beef industry losing prices at the same time that this thing is rocketing to all-time record levels, you've got to ask yourself the question, how in the world can that happen? But then you go back and you've got a situation where the packers have lost their workforce and they can't use the cattle. And so they start paying less for the cattle to encourage the cattle not to come to market quite as quickly. Then you've got restaurants that are demanding, or the food service and the grocery industry, demanding that they get beef, and the supply of beef gets smaller and smaller, and so they're raising their prices to try to reduce that demand. And so it's hard to put rationale to it, but I can certainly see how it could happen without any illegal activity. But does that mean that it's right? And it's back to earlier in our conversation. I think that if we would have had 6 or 8 packers instead of 2 major packers instead of 2, that would not have happened, because you would have packers that have a full workforce that can kick that beef out, and that would increase the demand for the beef on the one side, and it would temper the pricing. It would put into a place a competitive situation. And the way that market worked, when you get into a market with so few players, all of a sudden you end up with a situation like that. So back to your question, I applaud the investigation because I think it'll bring to light some of the weaknesses of the market system, of the food chain that we have, but I don't necessarily feel it'll bring about any proof of any illegal activity. I question whether it will.
Whether it be cow-calf producers or feeders, we continue to see the number of producers decline as time goes on. With that situation, do you think there is a chance that our industry is in danger of becoming vertically integrated, like we've seen in the pork and poultry industries?
I think that threat always is out there. I think it's going to be a lot less attractive to the packers, and of course it's never been attractive to the producer. But the reason it's less attractive to the packers is because our industry requires so much capital with such a small return, and so because of that, it's the part that creates our problems. But it's also something that's, I think, has had a part in protecting us from that vertical integration. Because your average cattleman, including myself, if I took a good solid look at what I have got, the value of what I've got invested, compared to the bottom line, I think maybe even a CD in a bank would return better than that.
Yeah.
And that's the reason that I don't think the vertical integration is imminent, but it's always out there, and so we want to remain independent producers, and so part of the way we do that is do everything we can to ensure profitability and viability in the industry.
What do you think is going to happen to the American cattle producer if some changes aren't brought about to bring competition back into our markets?
It's never been easy to get into the cattle business, and it's never been easy to stay in the cattle business. And there's folks out there, there's a younger generation out there that is smart and ambitious and hardworking, and I've seen examples of them finding a way. And I think that the older generation, truly the large majority of the older generation, wants to see that happen. So if they have any opportunity to be able to see that transition go back to that younger generation, the independent cattlemen, I think that they're gonna do a lot of things. If there's any way that they can see that makes sense that they are going to be able to do that, the big part of that success in that equation is to have those younger individuals that make proposals to those producers that might be some really out-of-the-box kind of thinking, but they need to be able to show them the vision on how they can end up with the fruits of their labor over decades and decades, but yet be able to see this transition to this younger generation. So it's going to take some really creative things to see that happen. And I see examples of that all the time. It's not a wave that happens. It happens producer to producer, a younger producer going to an older producer and saying, this is my dream and this is what I think I can accomplish and this is an idea of how I think we can make this work. I'm an incurable optimist, but I truly believe it will happen.
Do you have any other statements you'd like to make regarding our cattle markets and any issues facing our cattle industry?
I would say that one of the keys that we haven't talked about that I think is so important is that export market for us. I think that we need to continue to really focus on that export market. And I believe that we're going to be, all of us will be better off if we think through what we have to say to the media, because in some cases I've heard organizations and I've heard individuals say things that make me wonder if I should ever take another bite of beef, So I think that regardless of your point of view and regardless of, whether your market focus is prime beef or organic beef or whatever, all of those things have a definite market niche, but we want to be careful not to
have one more question. From what you just said, you talk about tearing down another part of the business. Oftentimes in our industry, we fight more amongst ourselves than actually fighting the issues that are trying to tear down our industry. Do you think as an industry we can get together on the same page, such as our cattle organizations? Do you think they can ever agree on some common goals and work towards those?
Yeah, it's one of those deals where if we take a good look and if we think about the organizations that are polar opposites, and if they were to sit down and really think it through, the goals of all of those organizations, I'll bet you it's 95 to 99% of the goals of those organizations are the same. It's just that they've taken considerably different paths to get there. So you just want to make sure that you can promote your ideas, but we really need to guard against